Bessie Coleman, the first black female aviator, was denied entry to American flight schools and therefore moved to France, where she learned French and earned her license in 1921. She became a celebrated stunt flyer and refused to perform at venues that practiced racial segregation of any kind. Nancy Wake, codename Helene, was the most decorated Allied woman of the Second World War. A New Zealander based in France, she worked in the resistance and led thousands of Maquis fighters. The Gestapo nicknamed her the White Mouse and offered an enormous reward for a capture they never achieved. Salvador Dali's remark about not taking drugs because he was the drug himself, alongside the painting The Face of War from 1941. The work was created during the artist's exile in the United States and reflects the horror of the Spanish Civil War, with a face whose mouth and eyes contain infinite skulls. Japanese archers photographed in the 1860s in a colorized image. Kyudo, the traditional Japanese art of archery, is a discipline combining martial technique and spiritual practice. Photographs from this period document the final years of feudal Japan, shortly before the modernization of the Meiji era. System Violators, a photograph of a high school computer club from the mid-1980s. That generation grew up with the first affordable personal computers and formed the cultural foundation of the hackers, programmers, and entrepreneurs who would define the digital revolution in the decades that followed. On August 8, 1982, a foul ball struck a 4-year-old boy in the head at Fenway Park. Player Jim Rice leapt over the stands, gathered the child in his arms, and ran with him to the stadium's medical area, saving his life in an act that became legendary in the history of American baseball. Danny Trejo and his daughter in the early 1990s. The actor spent years in prison during his youth before recovering from addiction and working as a drug counselor. He entered cinema by chance as a boxing trainer on a set and built a career spanning hundreds of action films over several decades. In 1974, Daniel Serene, then 22 years old, pointed his camera at 2 mimes performing in Central Park. Decades later, revisiting the negatives, he realized that one of them was Robin Williams, still a Juilliard student and completely unknown to the public at that particular time. New York was the scene of enormous celebration following the unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany. Crowds filled Times Square in May 1945 on Victory in Europe Day, ending nearly 6 years of war on the European continent. The war in the Pacific would still last 3 more months until August. William Casby, at 106 years old, holding his great-great-granddaughter. Born into slavery in Danville, Virginia in 1857, he lived to witness extraordinary transformations in American history. His portrait, taken by Richard Avedon, is among the photographer's most striking, staring directly at the camera. Oxford students after their exams in 1989. The tradition of celebrating the end of examinations with champagne and flour, known as trashing, is a centuries-old ritual at the university. Students wear the mandatory formal dress called subfusc, required at all exams and official ceremonies there. Robert Plant of Led Zeppelin holds a dove that suddenly landed on his hand during a concert. The unexpected moment was captured during a performance by the band, then the biggest attraction in world rock. Plant always had a messianic stage presence that matched the scene perfectly and memorably. Female extras for Cleopatra in 1963. The 20th Century Fox production was the most expensive ever made up to that point, with costs that nearly bankrupted the studio. It employed thousands of extras and built monumental sets in Rome while also generating the famous Taylor and Burton romance. Gary Sinise with his childhood friends at Halloween, wishing everyone happy holidays. The actor built a career in Forrest Gump, Apollo 13, and CSI NY, but devotes much of his time to philanthropic work with American military veterans through his foundation and his band supporting the troops. Seth MacFarlane in 1999, the year Family Guy premiered on American television. The animator was only 25 years old when the series aired, making him one of the youngest creators in television history. The show would be canceled twice and revived by popular demand on DVD and reruns. Christina Ricci and Jimmy Workman behind the scenes of The Addams Family in 1991. Ricci was 11, and her portrayal of Wednesday would become iconic, defining the character for generations. She would later build a solid career in independent cinema, escaping the child actress label entirely. A Pawnee family photographed in 1889. The Pawnee people inhabited the plains of Nebraska and Kansas and possessed a complex culture with sophisticated astronomy and developed agriculture. By that period, they had been removed to Indian Territory, suffering devastating population losses along the way. Javier Bardem and Penelope Cruz in 1992, the year they appeared together in Jamon Jamon, a film by Bigas Luna. Both were young unknowns at that time. They married in 2010 and became the most successful couple in Spanish cinema, each winning Academy Awards in supporting performance categories. Gary Sinise receiving his first guitar in 4th grade in the early 1960s. His passion for music would accompany him throughout life, even while building a career as an award-winning actor. Decades later, he would found the Latin Dan Band, dedicated to performing for American military personnel worldwide, Jordan Peele in 1999. The comedian was then beginning his career in improvisation and television long before forming the duo Key and Peele. In 2017, he would debut as a director with Get Out, a social horror film that won the Academy Award for Best Original Screenplay and redefined the genre entirely. Baby Eminem with his mother in 1973. Marshall Mathers grew up in extremely difficult circumstances in Detroit, moving constantly from home to home. His troubled relationship with his mother would become a recurring theme in his lyrics, even generating lawsuits between the two over the following years. Marlon Brando before and after makeup during the filming of The Godfather in 1971. The actor was only 47 and needed to age considerably to portray Vito Corleone. He wore a dental appliance that altered his jaw, creating the character's distinctive and instantly recognizable manner of speech. Meiko Kaji, star of Lady Snowblood and direct inspiration for Tarantino's Kill Bill in the Tokyo subway in the 1970s. The Japanese actress and singer starred in classics of revenge cinema, and her songs were used by Tarantino in the soundtracks of his own films decades later in Hollywood. A child in 1948 watching television for the first time. That year, the number of sets in American homes began growing exponentially, rising from a few thousand to millions within a few years. Television would radically transform family life, consumption, and politics across the entire country. Courtney Cox in her high school yearbook photograph, 1982. The actress studied architecture before moving into modeling and acting. She would achieve worldwide fame 12 years later with Friends, but was already known for appearing in Bruce Springsteen's Dancing in the Dark music video in 1984. People sleeping on a fire escape to cool off on a hot summer night in New York in 1948. Before air conditioning became widespread, sleeping on fire escapes, rooftops, and in parks was common practice in American cities during heat waves, which could prove lethal in crowded tenement buildings. Keanu Reeves visiting his paternal grandmother in Hawaii in 1996. The actor, of Hawaiian and Chinese descent on his father's side, maintained family ties to the islands throughout his life. During that period, he was already a global star after Speed, but kept a notably reserved personal profile. Stevie Nicks of Fleetwood Mac in 1980. The singer was at the height of fame following Rumors, one of the best-selling albums in history, and would launch her solo career the following year with Belladonna. Her mystical style, with shawls and flowing dresses, created an aesthetic copied for generations. Sir David Attenborough introduces his daughter to a noisy cockatoo in 1959. The British naturalist was then beginning his long career at the BBC, which would span more than 7 decades. He became the most recognizable voice in nature documentaries and a leading advocate for environmental conservation. Linda Hamilton and her identical twin sister, Leslie Hamilton, at the premiere of Terminator 2 in 1991. Leslie worked as a body double in the film, enabling scenes in which Sarah Connor appears duplicated. Outside of cinema, she worked as a nurse and completely avoided any form of public exposure. Chris Farley as a camp counselor in 1986. The future Saturday Night Live comedian was studying at Marquette University during that period and played rugby. His enormous physical energy and self-deprecating humor were already evident years before he became a national comedy star in the United States. Mel Brooks turns 100 years old, having been born in 1926. The comedian and filmmaker created classics such as Blazing Saddles and Young Frankenstein, and is one of few people to win an Oscar, Emmy, Grammy, and Tony. He served in the American Army during the Second World War, defusing landmines. Someone on a Seinfeld forum claimed that nobody actually wore Elaine's hairstyle in 1990, and a photograph proved otherwise. The character's voluminous curly hair was in fact absolutely typical of American women's fashion at the beginning of that decade throughout the entire country and beyond. Stephen and Viola Armstrong watched their son Neil become the first person to walk on the moon in 1969. The broadcast was followed by roughly 650 million people worldwide, the largest television audience recorded up to that moment in the entire history of mass communication and human achievement. Uma Thurman and her brother in the 1990s. The actress came from an unconventional intellectual family, daughter of a professor of Buddhist studies who was the first Westerner ordained as a Tibetan monk. She would achieve definitive fame with Pulp Fiction in 1994 and later Tarantino's Kill Bill. Steve Martin in the 1960s. Before becoming one of the greatest stand-up comedians in the United States, Martin worked at Disneyland selling guidebooks and later as a television writer. He studied philosophy at university, an influence clearly perceptible in his absurdist and intellectual comedy style. Kurt Russell on the set of Stargate in 1994. The science fiction film, directed by Roland Emmerich, would become a franchise with multiple enormously successful television series. Russell was already a genre veteran after memorable collaborations with John Carpenter during the previous decade of his career. Stellan Skarsgård and his son Alexander in 1978. The Swedish actor would build an international career in films by Lars von Trier and in major Hollywood productions. Alexander would follow in his father's footsteps and distinguish himself in series such as True Blood and Big Little Lies. Carl Weathers, Jesse Ventura, and Arnold Schwarzenegger at the premiere of Predator in 1987. The film's cast featured an extraordinary concentration of bodybuilders and wrestlers, and 2 of its members would go on to become governors of American states, Schwarzenegger and Ventura, respectively. The Berggren sisters of the band Ace of Base in 1993. The Swedish group released the album Happy Nation that year, which would become one of the best-selling debut records in history, with hits like All That She Wants and The Sign dominating world charts throughout the entire following year. Raffaella Carrà, the first woman to show her navel on Italian television in 1970. The singer and presenter was a revolutionary figure in Italian and Spanish popular culture, challenging the conservatism of the era with her uncomplicated sensuality and openly defending women's freedom and autonomy. A Polaroid of Steve Buscemi dressed as a woman on the set of Somebody to Love in 1994. The actor was then a constant presence in American independent cinema, working with Quentin Tarantino, the Coen brothers, and Jim Jarmusch, building one of the most distinctive careers of his generation. Kathy Geiswhite and her character Kathy in 1982. The cartoonist created the strip in 1976 based on her own frustrations with work, relationships, and body image. The series ran for 34 years in more than 1,400 newspapers, becoming a landmark reference in American women's humor. Sarah Michelle Gellar, Seth Green, and Allison Hannigan, filming the episode The Prom of Buffy in 1999. The series redefined teen television by combining horror, comedy, and drama with sophisticated writing, becoming an object of academic study and influencing an entire generation of television productions. Ian McKellen in 1968. The British actor was then building a career in classical theatre, especially Shakespeare, before achieving worldwide fame decades later as Gandalf and Magneto. He publicly came out as gay in 1988 and became one of the leading LGBT activists in the United Kingdom. Children Walking with Their Grandmother in Greenland, 1973. Life in Greenlandic Inuit communities was undergoing profound transformation during that period, with Danish modernization policy concentrating populations in towns and altering subsistence practices that had been maintained for millennia. Two photographs of John Lennon, taken 1 year apart, in 1966 and 1967. The visual transformation between the images is dramatic and reflects the radical change in the Beatles during that period, from the suited pop group to the psychedelic experimentalism of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Elizabeth Plain, who lived from 1859 to 1914, daughter of a Cornish copper miner, settled in northern Queensland. The migration of Cornish miners to Australia was an important 19th-century phenomenon, bringing British techniques and traditions to remote communities in the Australian interior. Tippi Hedren photographed with one of the pet tigers that lived with her at her California home in 1982. The actress, star of Hitchcock's The Birds, raised big cats at her property and later founded the Shambhala Preserve, dedicated to rescuing abandoned exotic animals from across the country. Joe Pesci on a date with Naomi Campbell in 1998. The actor was then virtually retired from cinema, having stepped away after Casino in 1995 to devote himself to music. Campbell was among the most sought-after models in the world, at the absolute peak of the supermodel era that defined the 1990s. Curtis Jackson, known as 50 Cent, and his son Marquise in 1999. During that period, the rapper was still seeking a foothold in the industry and would survive being shot 9 times in 2000. His 2003 debut album would become one of the best-selling hip-hop records of all time, cementing his rise. An original photograph from the first Indianapolis 500 race in 1911. The event was won by Ray Haraun at an average speed of roughly 75 miles per hour. Haraun also introduced the first rear-view mirror in motorsport history, allowing him to race without a riding mechanic aboard. Dan Aykroyd in the late 1970s, the Canadian comedian was a pillar of the original Saturday Night Live cast and created the Blues Brothers with John Belushi, a project that yielded hit albums and a cult film. He would later co-create and star in Ghostbusters, released in 1984 to enormous success. Jamie Lee Curtis's parents, Janet Leigh and Tony Curtis, in 1954. The couple formed one of Hollywood's most glamorous marriages of that decade. Lee would become immortal through the shower scene in Psycho, and their daughter would follow her mother by debuting in horror with Halloween in 1978. Mark Hamill, Carrie Fisher, and Harrison Ford relaxed in 1977, the year the first Star Wars was released. None of the three imagined the impact the film would have. Hamill and Fisher were virtually unknown, and Ford worked as a carpenter between small roles until landing the part of Han Solo.